Hello and welcome to this special episode of RWR Plays TEW. I bring you this today to address something very, very specific, which I'll get to in just a second. But before I do that, I just want to make it clear this is not the beginning of a new series. I'm not going to be playing and doing a series as WWF in 1994, though I would love to because it was when I first started watching wrestling. And also, I've not ended the WCW Lives On series. That is going to continue. But I was notified on one of my other videos by Straight Edged Junkie that there is a new TEW game coming. Now, I wasn't aware of this. I didn't see anything on the website or on the forums. In fairness, I'm not on those things very often. And he kind of told me that there's a new game coming out, and it is going to be called TEW IX. They're eschewing the year names, I think, because they've put on their announcement that they're worried about the fact that in modern gaming, having the year at the end of a game suggests an annual release, which is obviously not what TEW do. And so one of the things I've been thinking about for a little while, actually, even before I knew that the new game was out or was going to be coming out, is that I've been thinking about doing a video about desired improvements to the game. And I thought, well, I may as well do it now. So I think what will probably happen at some point in the future is I will probably maybe not review the new game, but certainly review the features of the new game. So they are sort of announcing the new features on a regular basis as we speak now on the forums. Go over to the Grey Dog Software forums to see some of those new features if you're not aware of the fact that there is a new game coming out. But at the moment they've only kind of done that for 3 days, and there's not a huge amount of detail yet. There's some new features and they're interesting, and I said I'll sort of have a look at those and sort of give my thoughts on them at some point in the future, in a future video. But this video is more about the features that I was looking to see from a new game. Now, what I should say as well before I go into this is that Grey Dog Software have sort of said about the new game that it's not a rebuild of the game. It is just really an update. I think the idea is they're going to build upon the current TEW 2020 kind of base and add lots of new features and increase the size of the game, maybe improve little bits and pieces here and there, but they won't be fundamentally rewriting the game. And I think some of the things that I was looking for from a new game would require possibly for them to rewrite large parts of the mechanics of the game. And so I don't expect them to do this in TEW 9, but maybe in a future rebuild of the game, a future big kind of sequel to the game, maybe that they can do some of this stuff. So let's get into some of the things I wanted to see. And what I've done, there's so many different things that I would like to see in the game that I thought I would only give you my top 5, because I think otherwise this video could go on for a very long time. Now, the main feature I really want to see, or the main improvement I want to see, is to popularity, because I feel this is a bit of a bugbear of mine in general. In fact, all of these things are a bit of a bugbear of mine in the game. Popularity is obviously a core part of the game. The size of the company. Now, as you can see, you've got, and as everyone knows, you've got kind of the regions of the game and then your popularity within each region. And that's fine. That's how the game works. And from a perspective of the out-of-the-box universe that TEW used, the Cornellverse, that is fine, because ultimately it doesn't have to mimic real life. It can just be its own, standalone, in isolation universe. But everybody knows that the big part of TEW is the mods. The real world mods, the present day mods, and the historical mods are what most people value for TEW. And in the real world, popularity causes a bit of a problem. Now, I'm going to try and find a company that helps me make this point as best I can. Let's take ECW, because I think ECW is a really clear one, right? Here's their kind of popularity in all the different regions of the US, and you can select all the different areas of the game, all the way down to India, where they've got very little, and you can see their popularity, right? Fine. But this doesn't allow for types of popularity, okay? And ECW is a really good example of this. So in the Tri-State, for example, they have a 50 popularity in this mod. This is a mod from 1994. Now, for me, that's just completely wrong. There's no way they had a popularity of 50 in the Tri-State area. But what the modder has tried to do is mimic the kind of the amount to which they were the fans of ECW were into the product in the tri-state area. So they've had to kind of really over exaggerate the level of popularity ECW had to the wider wrestling audience in 1994. Let's not forget, this isn't 1997 when they were on pay-per-view. This is kind of early ECW. They've had to overinflate that popularity to create the game circumstance for ECW, right? And so what I'm proposing is that the popularity should be broken down into two things. One of them is the wider popularity and the other is the core popularity. So in this instance, for example, I would expect ECW's popularity probably in most of the areas of America to be lower than 20 and lower than sort of 30. Maybe in tri-state it would be about 30, 40, something like that. But in the meantime, there should be a core popularity with that sort of is sort of below the wider popularity, which is kind of maybe a percentage of that wider popularity. So for example, if they had a popularity of 40 in tri-state, there could be a core popularity of, I don't know, 75, 80%. And the idea here would be that it would be about your popularity amongst the whole potential wrestling audience. And that includes everyone from hardcore wrestling fans who watch everything right up to kind of casual fans who perhaps tune in once a year for WrestleMania because they used to like wrestling when they were a kid. And within that audience, if you were at sort of 100 popularity, that would mean that every single person within that spectrum of fans could potentially tune into your show on a weekly basis. And the lower you went down, the more kind of less mainstream, if you like, the less widespread your appeal to the wrestling fan base would be. But your percentage popularity would then denote how much of that audience of your popularity was your core fans, who were then going to be willing to pretty much show up to every show, tune into every television program you put on, and were ultimately willing to pay for to watch that show. And the reason I think this is really important is that there's two examples one in the modern one right now and then one from about 15 years ago that I think really kind of accentuates this. For example, AEW right now, okay, they have got a decent widespread or wider audience. They've got a decent wider audience, but they have a very strong core audience. Their fan base is largely made up of people who are very, very loyal to that product, who are really into that product and really like that product. So you might say that let's say their core fan base is say 50% of the people that watch AEW, and that is kind of bore out by the fact that most AEW pay-per-views do over 100,000 buys. Some have even got close to 200,000 buys, and their TV audience is only about 650, 700,000, and at its peak it's been about 1 million, right? So AEW have a good wider audience, not an amazing wider audience, but a good level of wider audience, but also a very strong core audience who are willing to pay for their product. Then you take TNA, for example, who I would argue had a slightly larger, wider audience than AEW. If you go back to 2010, that period of time, there were as many as 2 million, 2.5 million people watching Impact weekly. The difference was their core audience was very small in comparison. The percentage of people that would be willing to pay for TNA in their heyday was very, very small. Like, they would get minuscule pay-per-view buy rates from nearly all of their pay-per-views. Like, we're talking 10,000 people, and that was often at most. Many times it was much lower than that. So that's a real world scenario where TNA had probably a slightly bigger, wider audience than AEW do now, but they had a much smaller core audience. And the reason that matters is because it should affect the way you play the game. So, for example, if you're AEW and you've got that really big core audience, you might want to exploit that by putting on more pay-per-views because you know people are going to be willing to pay for those pay-per-views, and by putting on shows in bigger arenas because you know there are more people likely to buy tickets. Whereas if you play as TNA, you might not want to do pay-per-views because you're not making much money from them anyway. And so instead you save all your best stuff for television in a bid to get the best TV deal because you've got a really wide good wider audience that will be invested in watching that TV show week to week, and therefore you can exploit that and get the best TV deal you can, so that improves your business in a different way. You basically make your money in a different way. And I just think that would be more realistic, because if you imagine, again, looking at TNA, for example, they very rarely toured. And when they did, they got very small audiences. Like their best audiences came when they would come over to the UK, once a year for 2 or 3 dates a year. And they would at times get, 5,000 to 6,000 fans. And that was a huge success for the company at that time. AEW come over to Wembley and get 70,000 people to buy tickets. So there's a clear indication there of, AEW can make more money from live attendance, and possibly TNA, back in the heyday of TNA, could have got better TV deals out of Impact, because they've got this wider audience, which is I mean, I've said it's bigger than AEW. Maybe it's about the same when you consider the fact that TV ratings in general are down. But it's just a way to illustrate. It's not. I'm not criticizing or trying to critique either TNA or AEW. It's just a way of explaining what I mean by having 2 levels of popularity: a wider audience figure and then a core audience figure. And that core audience really dialing into the numbers of people who, within that wider audience, who are interested in your product. How many of them, or what proportion of those, are willing to pay for your product and are willing to pretty much turn up whenever they're in your area, or will always buy their pay-per-views. So, and I think that's really important, because and ECW is a really good example of that, because again, they didn't have a huge wide audience, especially in 1994, but their audience in 1994 was incredibly cult-like. It was, you could be talking about 85-90% core audience for ECW, people who would turn up every single time to the ECW arena and watch their TV shows and buy their DVDs and all the rest of it. So, and that also could theoretically impact who it is that you sign as those companies. So, for example, ECW didn't make major signings really very often, and didn't need to. They had a core audience who were so into them that they would turn up, and ECW was able to build up stars internally much easier, because the number of people who turned up to their shows and were invested in their shows wasn't dependent on the star value that they brought to them. Whereas TNA found or felt that they had an issue where they needed to keep bringing in ex-WWE talent or big stars, because they didn't have a strong core audience that were really into their kind of guys that were there week on week. So they needed to bring in, the likes of Christian and Booker T and Hogan eventually, and people like that. If you've got a strong core audience, then your ability to draw is not reliant upon star names. However, if you have a really wide audience but not a very hardcore audience, then your ability to draw is much more dependent on who's on a given show at any one point. And there are fluctuations, don't get me wrong, dependent on the level of star power that you've got on any individual show, but it's nearly always within a very small range, because that range is based upon this one popularity number, which is this what we've currently got right now. So for me, that's the biggest change I'd like to see the game, and possibly the thing that would be hardest to build in to the game and require some degree of a rebuild of the whole thing, because I'm changing the whole dynamics of the way popularity works, the way that wrestlers impact attendances, pay-per-view buy rates, and all the rest of it. But I think that would make the game so much more realistic and would allow for gameplay that was so much more realistic. Now, the second change I'd like to see made are TV show success kind of measures, basically. So there's this thing in the game where effectively you've got your TV shows, and in this particular case, Monday Night Raw at the time was only an hour, and they've taped 3 shows at a time. Great. And they are judged by the by the network that they're on through the prism of the quality of the show. And I just think that's ridiculous. So, for example, let's say you're on the USA Network. They ask you at the outset of that contract for a minimum quality of the show of, say, 60, based on the rating that the TV show gets when you're broadcasting it. Now, to me, that's ridiculous. That shouldn't be the way what what the network care about. All they should be cared about is the figures, the ratings that you draw. So you should be able to sign a TV deal, and at the offset of that TV deal, the network should project the amount of viewers that they think you should get, and then go, in order for you to stay on this show at the end of this contract, you need to have kept the ratings above this level. And that should be all it's judged upon. It should not be judged upon the quality of the show, the quality of what you produce. That should affect your popularity with the wider audience. But the TV show should not be dependent on that. The TV show should be dependent on the ratings that your overall popularity plus the stars that you've signed have allowed you to get in terms of ratings. And I think that's a major, major problem, because it basically means that if you start off as WWF, for example, and you've got a really big TV deal, sometimes it's impossible to live up to the standards that the network require you to hit, despite the fact that you're drawing massive ratings because you are WWF and you have this huge popularity. So let's say, for example, week in, week out, you were producing a really bad television show, then the network shouldn't care about that and wouldn't even really know about that. They wouldn't necessarily know that a bad wrestling show had been put out to their fans. What they would see was in 2, 3, 4, 6, 10, 15, 20 weeks, a downward trend in those ratings as a consequence of the poor show, and then respond to it that way. And I think this is really, really important. And I think that this should be something that they change. And I don't think it's something that would be difficult to change. So even if you forgot what I was talking about earlier on with the 2 different types of popularity, if you just built this into the game, you just changed the thing that the network or the broadcaster cared about from being the quality of the show that's been produced to the rating that you garner as a consequence of that show. And so I think you could be a company that was on borrowed time, in that you were getting the ratings that the network was satisfied with, but your show was of a quality that was poor, that meant that your popularity was slowly reducing, and therefore in the end your ratings would drop. And this would mimic, for example, WCW at the end of the Monday Night Wars, where basically, let's say in 1999, at the beginning of the year, they're getting the ratings that TNT, for example, would have been happy with at that time. Huge television ratings for the time. But then, as the year progressed, and as they produced less and less good quality shows, that rating dropped down, and that was then what impacted their ability to stay on TNT, and on when ultimately led to the decision for AOL Time Warner to drop the show entirely. So this would be a thing that I would like to see as a change to the way television shows are measured by the networks that you're on. And there's another thing as well, which is that in order to sign a new deal with a broadcaster, for example, you need to live up to certain criteria that exist prior to you trying to negotiate. So, for example, there are networks on here that do not want to deal with me. For example, 3SAT, right? They're not interested in negotiation with WWF, as we do not pass all of their requirements. And let's see what they don't. They do not meet the minimum popularity requirements for this area. Now, fair enough. I can understand why that's been built into the game, but let's be fair. For a network in Central Europe, that might not be that big a deal. They might, they might be like, okay, well, in Central Europe, you don't currently have a big fan base, but the network wouldn't necessarily care about that. In the same way as, for example, the network didn't really care about the size of AEW before they started broadcasting on TBS. Like, they know that the deal itself will improve their overall popularity. And let's not forget that WWF were an established name producing television all over the world in 1994. So there's no reason why 3SAT would need to just worry about the minimum popularity requirements, and especially as they pass all the other requirements for what a company needs to get onto their network. You think, look, to be honest, the production values are incredible. The music levels are licensed. The company size is way bigger than we would necessarily need. The product's acceptable. Everything about this is great programming, and maybe the only thing that's impacted by WWF not meeting the minimum popularity requirements is the amount of money and the length of time that deal should go. So for example, let's say 3SAT said, right, you don't meet our minimum popularity requirements. There should be a mechanism within the game for them to negotiate with WWF and say, well, as you don't meet the minimum requirements, we're willing to give you a 3-month trial period where you need to achieve this amount of rating. And at the same time, we're not going to pay you for it. We're basically going to we're going to allow you to come onto our network, and you have to do it for free. Now, WWF might turn around and go, no, forget that. We're going to go with a different network in Central Europe that don't require us to be as big in order for us to do a good deal. But that option should be open. It shouldn't just be a blanket, no, we're not even going to talk to you. Now, maybe in some cases that would be the case. If I was, for example, a very small independent company in America, and I approached 3SAT and I had terrible production values and all the rest of it, fair enough, they might not want to talk to me at all. But when it comes to the WWF, they should already have a foot in the door just because they are WWF, and 3SAT should be interested in just meeting with them at the very least, so that then WWF could offer them this deal where they go, look, you can have our TV for free. In fact, we'll even pay you to put the TV show on, and then and put it on for 6 months. And if it doesn't get the ratings you want, then you can choose to dump us off the air. Or they could say, well, after 6 months, 3SAT could come back and say that the ratings are terrible. There's really little value in us keeping this on, and WWF go, well, we'll pay you even more money to keep it on, as if just because WWF are trying to build a kind of following there. So I feel like, again, this is a situation where the game's too limited, it's too structured, it's too kind of set in a very simple rule set, and in this case I feel like there's a way to open this up a bit more. Let's say, for example, the only thing that WWF didn't meet in the requirements for 3SAT was their production values. There's no reason why 3SAT couldn't demand that WWE's production values were increased in order to in order to get a TV deal. So let's say WWF were coming in with less than professional production values. 3SAT could go, look, we'll put you on air, but you need to spend X amount of money on your production values in order for it to be of a good enough quality for us to air on our network. And that should be possible. Again, right now, the game prevents you from even talking to them because your production values aren't that high. But that shouldn't be the way. Again, the network should be able to come back to you and say, right, in order for you to get on our network, this is what we require, whether it be money, whether it be a percentage of the advertising revenue, whether it be a shorter term deal, whether it be an increase in production values, whatever it is, that should there should be a dialogue that's able to go between yourself and the network. Okay, there's more to that, but I don't want to go into it in too much detail because I've spent quite a long time on it. So let's move on to contract limitations. So obviously you've got a universe full of wrestlers, and you can see I haven't got pictures on here for some reason. This isn't going to be a problem for WWE, but if you are, let's say, a new company that starts up, okay, you might say that you've got zero popularity at the beginning of the game. But if you've got loads and loads of money, you should be able to negotiate with any wrestler. Instead, what happens, let's say there's a big free agent that's out there that's available, but you can't sign them because in the game prevents you from even talking to them because you're not big enough. So let's say, for example, in 2001, Ken Shamrock, this is a good example because I've been doing it on the WCW Lives On series, and I haven't been able to sign him because my company's not big enough. But Ken Shamrock is available. He won't even talk to me, despite me being WCW. He won't even talk to me because he says we're not big enough for him. Now that's ridiculous. Ken Shamrock might be cynical going into those conversations, but there's no way Ken Shamrock would turn around and go, I'm not even talking to you because you're not big enough. Shamrock would talk to WCW and he would say, look, you're not really big enough for me, but if you're willing to spend a lot of money on me, then I could be convinced. So we may have to pay over the odds for a Ken Shamrock if we're WCW and he thinks that we're too small for him, but we wouldn't be blocked from talking to him. And to be honest, if we were a brand new company that had no brand recognition, nothing, but we had $100 million to spend, Ken Shamrock would still talk to us. If I was saying that we'll give you $10 million to appear on our shows, he would definitely talk to us. So again, I feel like the game is too rigid in this situation. Wrestlers should talk to anybody who's willing to pay a certain amount of money. If you've got the money to talk to a Ken Shamrock or to any free agent in the game, let's say for example I'm AEW or I'm TNA back in 2010, and I talk to The Rock, and The Rock in the game world is even out of the business at that point. Again, him being out of the business should not be a blocker to me talking to him and potentially luring him out of retirement for a certain amount of money. And if TNA approached The Rock in 2010 and offered him, I don't know, $5 million per appearance for 5 appearances, I think there's a good chance The Rock would accept that deal. That's $25 million for 5 appearances, possibly just 5 matches, but possibly just angles. You might even have to pay more if you want him to have a match. Maybe $5 million per appearance with an extra $3 million on top if you want him to work a match. Again, I think there's a good chance The Rock accepts that deal. Now, maybe you wouldn't, but you could see how this could get extreme. You could go even further. You go, The Rock will give you $100 million to work one match. I mean, he's not going to turn that down. Like, I don't care what size the promotion is. The Rock is not going to turn down $100 million for one match. So, again, the game could do with a bit more of a reality based approach to this stuff. The reason I say this is because, you know, one of the mods or one of the things I would like to edit into the game is a company with no popularity and no kind of momentum or prestige or anything from the very beginning, but give them loads and loads of money and therefore be able to sign whoever they want that was available, possibly even sign people over from WWF and WCW when they were or sorry, let's say we're doing it in the modern era of WWE and AEW, and potentially when their contracts come up, lure them across because they're able to offer so much money. But you can't do that in the game because the game blocks you from even talking to them because they say, well, you're not big enough. And I just don't think that's realistic. I think if I was able to turn around to Adam Copeland, I said that because his name's on the screen right now. If I was able to turn around to Adam Copeland when his WWE deal came up for a very small company and say, look, I'm willing to offer you $20 million this year to work for me. And Tony Khan comes in and says, I'm willing to offer you 5. I mean, there's a good chance. It's maybe not necessarily the case, but there's a good chance Adam Copeland would take my deal. So, for me, there's an absence of reality there. I think if they're big stars and they are available, they're free agents, and you have got lots of money and you can potentially offer them lots of money, they should at least hear you out and see what they might be willing to offer. Okay, so the next thing I'm kind of calling conditional events, and when I say events, I'm not talking about wrestling events. I'm talking about actual things that are taking place in the game. So obviously you've got the news feed that comes up each day, and there's all kinds of different stuff, and it's usually just stuff that's happening in the game. But you also, if anybody who's played this game with mods, for example, will know that there are news stories that you can add to the mod that take place during the game. Like, I think the one I've seen best was one of the mods from 1987 in TEW 2016, where you'd see like news stories pop up and it would be, Hogan appears in new film or whatever, like stuff that the modder had built into the game to happen on specific dates. What I'd like to see is an expansion of that, but into conditional news stories and conditional events in general. So, for an example, everybody knows that WCW in real life stopped running at the end of March 2001. Okay, now that was as a consequence of AOL Time Warner, who owned Turner Broadcasting by 2001, were not interested. Their execs were not interested in WCW. The ratings for WCW were real low, and they were losing millions of dollars every year. Now, those are the main 3 reasons. No matter how convoluted you want to get about it, and there are reasons for those things happening, those are the key reasons why WCW no longer existed. Now, if you're playing a mod, say, from 1998, and those 3 conditions exist at the end of March 2001, then that should trigger the event, which is the end of WCW. And that event should have options that take place as a consequence of that taking place. Let's say, for example, those three conditions were in place in March 2001 in this game. At that point, there could be two or three options. One option could be that the WWF buys it, as they did in real life. One of them could be that Fusion Media Ventures buy it, which was a possibility at that time. And the other one could be maybe that somebody else, a random person or somebody else in the game or a random corporation buys WCW. And maybe each time you play this particular mod, there's an equal chance that any of these three things happen. You then have, let's say you were running WWF at the time, you've no control over it. Other than perhaps if you are playing as WWF, maybe you get something that pops up saying, do you want to purchase WCW? It will cost you X. And you can determine, based on how much money you've got, whether you feel you can afford that or not. Or maybe you want to make the game more interesting and you say, no, I'm not going to purchase WCW. Let's see what happens if I don't do it. And then there can be other options that happen within the game based on kind of just randomized things happening, that maybe someone buys WCW, or maybe the company just goes out of business. Maybe it just doesn't. Maybe it just ceases to exist. So any of those things, I think, should be able to happen in that situation. But equally, that event can be prevented from happening. So let's say you are playing this mod and the game start is 1998, you get to 2001, March 2001, and those three conditions that I suggested don't exist. Let's say they're still running a profit, let's say their ratings are better, then this trigger event doesn't happen and WCW just continues to exist. And that then could have further consequences. So the modder could also potentially build into this same mod that in sort of May 2002, TNA comes into existence, but only if certain conditions are met. And one of the conditions could be if WCW no longer exists as a separate entity. One of the main reasons TNA existed was to fill the gap left by WCW, and the fact that Jeff Jarrett was no longer employed, he and his father decided we can make our own promotion using a lot of the guys that were at ECW and WCW from the previous year. But if WCW still exists, I think there's a good chance TNA would never have come into existence, especially if Jeff Jarrett was also employed by WCW. So I think that there is a good opportunity here. So in this scenario, let's say we get to March 2001, the conditions don't exist for WCW to either be sold or closed, and therefore they continue to exist in the game beyond March 2001. Then you get to May 2002, and therefore TNA never comes into existence because WCW still exists. Now, this sounds relatively complex, and I'm sure the way I'm explaining it doesn't help with that. But genuinely, I think this is a really easy to accomplish thing that the game really could build into it and would make for much more interesting, exciting, and dynamic real-world historical mods, which would allow you to create new game worlds, and each time you played that mod, a different scenario might play out. Like, as I say, if you got to March 2001 and the conditions for WCW's end existed, then it could be that you buy them as WWF if you are running WWF, or WWF buy them as the AI, as playing as AI, or it could be that, as I say, Fusion Media Ventures buy them, or it could be that the company goes out of existence, or it could be that another corporation owns them. Maybe there are 4 or 5 different scenarios, I don't know. Maybe Hulk Hogan buys them, for example. That wouldn't be outside the complete realm of possibility. There are lots of different ways that could go, and each time it would create a different scenario for the game world that you were playing in. That was relatively convoluted. I've got one more thing which could also be convoluted, and apologies, but it's another big bugbear of mine, and that is company takeovers. So one of the biggest issues I've got with this, I'm playing as WWF in this particular save. I say I'm playing, this is an entirely new game, so I'm not actually playing as them. But, got all these different companies. Now, WWF have got more money pretty much than anybody else. They've got $10 billion, right? If I wanted to, there should be no reason why I can't, I'm trying to find what I'm looking for now. There should be no reason why I can't, for example, go to Michinoku Pro, who are owned by Jinsei Shinseiki, who perhaps they've got $50,000. They've got very little amounts of money, right? There should be no reason why I can't go to them and say, I want to buy you out. And they might, be able to turn around and go, well, if you want to buy us, it's going to cost you, I don't know, $500,000 or $1 million. I should be able to do that if I so wished to do it. The way the game works is you can't buy another promotion unless that promotion's in a significant amount of debt, and that then determines the amount of money that you have to pay to buy that company. But I think that's just nonsense. There's no reason why that should be the case. If, for example, Tony Khan and his father had decided they wanted to enter the wrestling business, and they offered to buy WWE for $2 billion or $5 billion or $20 billion, there's a really good chance that the shareholders of WWE, Vince McMahon being probably the primary shareholder at that point, there's a good chance they'd have sold up, because that's a lot of money we're talking about there. So, hell, they might have offered $100 billion, whatever it would have taken to do it. The point is that in real life, there's no limit to the amount of money. So long as someone has got that money, there's no limit to the amount of money that could be offered to buy the company. And this should be the same in the game. If I've got a company that has $100 million because I've got really, really big, let's say I'm the biggest company in the world, I've got hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm massive, there's no reason I shouldn't be able to buy out any other company. You know, even if it was AEW, you're talking about, you know, let's talk about today, a real world scenario. I'm WWE, I've got, let's say, I don't know, $500 million. No, I'd probably need a lot more than that. But let's say I've got, you know, loads and loads and loads and loads of money. If I've got enough money, regardless of how good AEW is doing in the game, I should be able to buy them out. There should be a way for me to even potentially approach that. And certainly, I should be able to go to Hammerlock Wrestling and buy them out. You know, they got $100,000 in the game, which is obviously way more money than they would have ever had. But let's say that's realistic. Even if they had $100,000, if I was to come along and offer Andre Baker $5 million for Hammerlock, he should accept it. He shouldn't need to be in debt for him to accept that offer. And I think this is really important because I like the business aspects of this game as well. And so I like the idea of having a promotion that's really big who starts to buy up all the other promotions. And maybe the receptibility to being purchased would vary depending on the characteristics of the individual owner. There's some work, in my opinion, to be done on dynamic ownership of companies. Like some companies should be owned by other corporations. Others should be owned by wrestlers. Some should be owned by people who've inherited it from their father, perhaps, who passed away, you know, things like that. But for me, there's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't be able to, as WWE in 1994, go to Andre Baker and buy Hammerlock Wrestling. That should be a realistic possibility as me, the owner of WWF, to go and buy a small regional promotion from the UK, where the owner would be very receptive to getting, you know, $1 million from me as the owner of WWF. So all those things I think should be possible, and that's just another thing where the game for me is often too rigid. It tries to put in place these rules that have no reason to exist. They're unnecessary. Now, I realise, having given you all that, I sound reasonably negative about the game. I really love TEW. I think it's a great game. I've played it for hours and hours and hours. I really enjoy it. But there are just these little things that I think aren't huge, but would just make the game feel more organic and more realistic. And especially when you're dealing with historical or present day mods, I think that's really important, because it just, you know, it frustrates me no end when I'm playing the WCW game. WCW being WCW, one of the most well-known wrestling promotions on the planet, and not being able to negotiate with certain people at all, not even be able to talk to them because they say that we're too small for them, and not being able to buy independent promotions, for example, because again, they're not in debt. Like, none of that makes sense. I should be able to do those things. So that's just my thoughts on what I would do with the game, or features I would like to see. If I, you know, in a new game. I'm aware that probably none of those things will happen, and I think some of them are too complex to happen in terms of what they're doing with the new game. Like, the new game is, you know, it's not a rebuild of the game. It's an expansion, an improvement. It will have more features. It will have more detailed features. It will have some improved features. Some of the things I'm talking about here are completely new features and probably would require a rebuild. But some of them I think are achievable, and I'd like to see them, because I think that there is a way to make the game much more organic for real world scenarios, and you know, I think that would be really good to see. Anyway, I think I've spoken for long enough. Apologies for the length of this video. I didn't think it would go quite as long, but some of the concepts are reasonably complicated, and I wanted to get into some of the detail. Thank you for watching. If you've liked this video, please give us a like and also let me know what you think of my thoughts, and tell me what you would like to see in terms of new features for the game. We'll be getting back to the WCW Lives On series pretty soon, but for now, thank you very much for watching.